The Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic will come to order. I want to welcome everyone, and I want to thank our panelists and all of our members that are here for being here, and I look forward to discussions that we will have. I also want to thank the ranking member, Dr. Ruiz, for his willingness to work on this subcommittee, and we have worked together very well for a long period of time since we came in together on many issues. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. And I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. This is the first time the new Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic has officially gathered for the 118th Congress. It's an honor and a privilege to be chair, and I look forward to the next 2 years of challenging but impactful work. We're the only committee in Congress explicitly charged with investigating a large swath of what happened over the course of the past 3 years associated with the pandemic, including the origins of COVID-19, policies surrounding and the use of gain-of-function or chimera-type research, fraud and taxpayer-funded pandemic programs, the impacts of lockdowns and other government policies, the impacts of school closures, including learning loss, social, mental, and physical health ramifications, and economic opportunity loss, vaccine and therapeutic development, and the subsequent mandates, and more. We are here to deliver an after-action review of the past 3 years, to learn from the past, not just what went wrong, but what was done right, and to prepare for the future. This is work that must be done thoroughly, and must be done with reverence, with an eye toward the truth, and based on facts. This is work that was put on the back burner or entirely ignored by the previous majority. But now is now, and frankly, our work and final report should be largely bipartisan. I look forward to working with everyone in this room, on both sides of the aisle, to achieve these goals and produce a product that can stand the test of time. And I strongly believe we have the team to achieve it. On each side of the aisle, we have a wide range of knowledge and experiences. Voices representing medicine and science, moms and dads, parents, business owners, local government leaders, and obviously, every member here has lived through the impacts of COVID-19. Today we get started and are joined by esteemed public health officials to help us chart a path forward, to help us understand what policies went wrong and how we as a country can improve. Americans feel that time and time again the government failed to adequately protect the American people and often failed to follow the science. Did we truly support America's children by not reopening schools? The government failed to rapidly reopen schools for in-person instruction. According to a study by Brown University economist Dr. Emily Oster, students who attended school mostly online for the 2020 to 2021 school year performed 13% lower in math and 8% lower in reading than their in-person counterparts. Further, according to the U.S. Surgeon General, children and teenagers are going through a once-in-a-lifetime mental health crisis, with 25% reporting experiencing depression and 20% experiencing anxiety symptoms. Suicide is also now the second leading cause of death nationally for children aged 10 to 14. Across the federal government, taxpayer-funded employees failed to report to work even after vaccines were widely available. According to data from the Office of Personnel Management in 2018, approximately 483,000 government workers were remote. During the pandemic, that number rose to more than 1 million. This left Americans across the country who were being laid off because of lockdowns struggling to get government services while government employees continued to receive all their benefits. Even more surprising, about 90% of the CDC were working remotely while responding to a once-in-a-century pandemic. Dr. Deborah Birx testified that the country would have been better served if the CDC operated in person. How were elderly Americans harmed when governors, like former New York Governor Cuomo, forced nursing homes to accept more than 9,000 recovering and potentially contagious coronavirus patients against CDC and CMS guidelines. To Governor Cuomo's decision to move over 9,000 recovering coronavirus patients from hospitals into nursing homes seed the virus amongst those most at risk for serious illness and death. It's a directive he later revoked under heavy criticism, but is yet to be held accountable for. The science was clear that infections from coronaviruses, including SARS and MERS, confer robust natural immunity. As a matter of fact, many scientists, feeling left out, recognize the existing science regarding infection-acquired immunity, as well as recognizing the pluses and minuses of mRNA vaccines. Now, more than 3 years into the pandemic, The Lancet published an analysis confirming the health benefit associated with infection-acquired immunity. They state that individuals previously infected with COVID are 88% less likely to succumb to serious disease for at least 10 months, a strength and duration seemingly on par with vaccine-induced immunity. On December 5, 2020, then President-elect Biden promised vaccines would not be federally mandated. Less than 1 year into his presidency, President Biden abruptly announced the national vaccine and testing mandate, a mandate never before imposed on employees or the American workforce. Personal physician consultations were not part of this process. Did this benefit or harm public health? Each one of these and many other decisions must and will be investigated thoroughly. The American people deserve to know and understand how and why these impactful decisions were made. Through this pandemic, there have been many mysteries, many unknowns. We've had to deal with hypotheticals and assumptions, understandably, especially early on in the pandemic. But when hypotheticals and assumptions proved to be incorrect, did we correct? Were we poised, or did we become poised to gather telling data and share that data with providers and with the public? Did we create unnecessary fear and, in some, and dangerous ambivalence in others? I could go on, and this committee will go on. Monday morning quarterbacking can be a healthy process if we allow it. Ask questions, question decisions, discover the reasoning, motives, and science behind decisions made. At the end of this process, our goal is to produce a product, hopefully bipartisan, based on knowledge and lessons learned. A product that can benefit and serve future generations and benefit the health and well-being of all Americans and others around the world. The pandemic will likely occur again, and when that happens, may we have the ability to predict, prepare, protect, and prevent. Today, we will hear from experts and begin to advance our path forward. Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to yield to the ranking member, recognize him for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Dr. Wenstra, my friend. We've had a very good bipartisan working relationship throughout the years, getting some good legislation signed into law together, and I'm looking forward to working with you in a bipartisan manner for the sake of our nation. The 117th Congress was a stellar Congress with a select subcommittee on COVID that reviewed nearly 1 million documents, had 394 letters sent, 42 hearings and briefings, 37 staff reports that have been published, and two overarching themes that we can grow from was, one, that we inadequately had the public health infrastructure to address a pandemic as large as this one, and we need to comprehensively take that lesson and invest in a public health infrastructure in order to identify these novel viruses, contain them, prevent them from being pandemics, and being able to mitigate and save as many lives as we possibly can while mitigating harm. The second biggest takeaway from that 118th Congress was the extreme dangers of disinformation and misinformation for political gain and not based on evidence or science. and that can lead to non-compliance or failure of therapeutics or misinformation where people are making decisions that put themselves and their families in harm's way. So when we speak of lessons learned and what went wrong, we must also have an honest discussion of what went right. And in fact, there were several things that went right. One is the investment to prevent more deaths and economic turmoil. We know that the economic support that was given worked in order to keep the economy afloat. However, the Democrats held multiple hearings last Congress focusing on the fraud and abuse that happened, and we definitely need to get to the bottom of it in order for that, in order to prevent that from happening again. Just recently, the Commonwealth Fund had a report on December 13, 2022, that showed that because of the administration's efforts, there were over 3 million lives saved. And that is a success. There could have been more, in my opinion. We should have had more. And so we need to understand the lessons learned, all the barriers of misinformation, disinformation, the politicization of this, and avoid those for the sake of our nation in order to save more lives. So today, the Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus Pandemic officially convenes for its first meeting of the 118th Congress. Our work comes at a crucial moment for our nation's public health. For 3 years, COVID-19 has presented our government and our society with unprecedented challenges. More than 1 million lives in the United States have been lost due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic was real and not a hoax, which laid bare vulnerabilities and inequities in our public health infrastructure and our economy. Although we have made significant strides to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, we are still dealing with the long-term implications of this public health crisis. COVID-19 continues to pose a serious threat to the health of some of the most vulnerable in our communities, and the spread of misinformation or disinformation has undermined the American people's trust in our nation's public health institutions and in each other, further dividing us at a time when we should come together to grieve and heal from a crisis that has taken a toll on each of us, regardless of our political affiliation. As ranking member of the Select Subcommittee, I am optimistic that our work to evaluate the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic can be responsible and objective. And I am pleased to be leading this Select Subcommittee alongside my friend and colleague from Ohio, Dr. and Chairman Wenstrup. Chairman Wenstrup and I, as I mentioned, have partnered on several shared priorities, and it is my hope that we can work constructively to advance the critical purpose of preventing and preparing for future pandemics. Because above all else, I'm confident that no one in the United States, regardless of political party, wants us to relive the experience of another deadly pandemic. Today's roundtable offers a meaningful opportunity for us to begin the work of objectively evaluating our nation's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I am pleased to have invited Dr. George Benjamin, fellow emergency physician and executive director of the American Public Health Association, to participate. However, I am troubled that other participants on today's panel have a well-documented history of downplaying the gravity of the COVID-19 pandemic and defying the overwhelming consensus of America's scientific research and public health communities, including by advocating for a reckless herd immunity strategy for a deadly novel virus we knew little about, and drawing into question vaccine policies that contributed to the prevention of more than 3 million fatalities. To successfully carry out the charge of this select subcommittee, our work must lead with facts and follow the science. Anything less would be a misguided use of our time and taxpayer dollars and a betrayal of the interests of the American people. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ruiz. Appreciate your comments. Our witnesses today are Dr. Martin Kulldorff. Dr. Kulldorff is a biostatistician and an epidemiologist and a professor on leave in the Department of Medicine at Harvard University. His research centers on developing and applying new disease surveillance methods for post-market drug and vaccine safety surveillance and for the early detection and monitoring of infectious disease outbreaks. He earned a bachelor's degree in mathematical statistics from Umeå University in Sweden, and is doctorate in operations research from Cornell University. Dr. Marty McCary. Dr. McCary is the Chief of Islet Transplant Surgery and a Professor of Surgery at Johns Hopkins University. He has served in leadership at the World Health Organization Patient Safety Program, elected to the National Academy of Medicine, and has published more than 250 peer-reviewed scientific articles. He earned a bachelor's degree from Bucknell University, a doctor of medicine from Thomas Jefferson University, and a master's in public health from Harvard University. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya is a professor of health policy at Stanford University and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research. His research has focused on the health and well-being of vulnerable populations, the epidemiology of COVID-19, and the evaluation of policy responses to the COVID pandemic. He has also published 135 articles in top peer-reviewed scientific journals. He earned a bachelor's degree, Master of Arts, Doctor of Medicine, and Doctor of Philosophy in Economics, all from Stanford University. Dr. George Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin is an Executive Director of the American Public Health Association. He was previously the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. He started his career in medicine as a military physician in the Army. Thank you, near and dear to my heart. Eventually rising to serve as the Chief of Emergency Medicine at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He earned a bachelor's degree from the Illinois Institute of Technology and a Doctor of Medicine from the University of Illinois College of Medicine. The Select Subcommittee certainly appreciates you all for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes or so. And as a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on, and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired, and we would ask that you please wrap up. We intend to go around the dais here to ask questions, and if there's time, we may have a second round. This time, I'd like to recognize Dr. Koldorf to give an opening statement.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for inviting me here. During the last 3 years, we have seen the worst public health mistakes in history. Very early on in the pandemic, it was clear from the data from Wuhan, China, that there is a 1,000-fold difference in risk by age. So older people, while anybody can get infected, older people have more than a 1,000-fold risk of dying from COVID compared to young people. There were two major failures or categories of failures during the pandemic. One was the failure to properly and optimally protect older Americans, those who are at high risk from dying from COVID. For example, we didn't protect nursing home residents properly. And it's not just by sending sick people to nursing home, which of course was criminal, but also we have too much staff rotation in nursing homes. We didn't do enough testing of nursing home staff to prevent infections to come in. We also didn't protect older working age Americans in the 60s and 70s, while the laptop class was often working from home, whether they were in the 20s or 30s or 40s. Many older working class Americans in the 60s and some in the 70s were still working as cab drivers in supermarkets and so forth, being infected. And in fact, the way we dealt with the pandemic was the worst assault on poor people, working Americans and middle class Americans since segregation and the Vietnam War. When, as part of the Great Barrington Declaration, together with Dr. Bhattacharya here and Dr. Snedda Gupta at Oxford University, when we proposed very concrete things for how to better protect older Americans who needed better protections, we were instead slandered by claiming that, for example, we advocated by wrongly stating that we advocated a herd immunity strategy. We have very concrete proposals for how to better protect older Americans, but that was dismissed and we were slandered instead of taken seriously. Secondly, lockdown harms, school closures, people not going to medical visits and so on, that has killed many Americans and will continue to do so in the next few years. For example, a woman who didn't get her cervical cancer screening in 2020 might now die next year or 2 years from now instead of living another 15, 20 years. So the lockdowns had enormously negative consequences on public health, on not only cancer screening and treatment, on cardiovascular disease treatments, diabetes care, vaccination rates for children plummeted. Vaccination is very important to vaccinate our young children. Also, of course, as was mentioned earlier, the mental health, both of the young people and older adults. So that was a major failure of our pandemic response. These failures are due to abandonment of basic principles of public health, and I mentioned two of them. One is that you cannot only focus on one disease, in this case COVID. You have to look at public health generally, all diseases, including chronic diseases, including mental health. We didn't do that. All the focus was on trying to suppress or eradicate COVID, which was impossible for a disease like COVID. The other thing, we were thinking short-term instead of long-term. Yes, you can do lockdowns and reduce short-term infections of COVID, but that has long-term consequences in, for example, cancer and cardiovascular disease. That was not considered. So there was never done a proper benefit risk or benefit harms analysis. Mistakes were made, and the pandemic response is a house of cards that's now falling apart one by one. I don't think that anybody left who thinks that school closures were a good idea. There is now being recognition that there is immunity after having had an infection. So there was never a reason to mandate vaccine for people who had already had COVID. There was recently a study of masks that shows that masks have zero or very limited benefit. So this house of cards is now falling apart. And we have a choice. We can either double down on those mistakes and pretend that they were not mistakes, or bury it in the sand, or we can have an honest evaluation of our response. And it's encouraging to hear from the opening statements of the chair and the ranking member that your intention is to have a very honest evaluation of our pandemic response. And I thank you both and the rest of your members for that. Thank you very much.
I think I now recognize Dr. McCary to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Winstrup and Ranking Member Ruiz and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to present. Public health officials have made many tragic mistakes during the pandemic. Failure to warn of the pandemic for months, ignoring natural immunity, dismissing the lab leak as a conspiracy, closing schools, masking toddlers, boosting young, healthy people, pushing boosters for young people, bypassing FDA expert panel customary votes that we've been using for decades, telling people to wash their hands like crazy, thinking it was a surface transmission problem, when the other known coronaviruses that cause severe illness, SARS and MERS, were both airborne. Routinely telling people that they have to get the second dose 3 or 4 weeks after the first dose, when good data came out of the UK that 3 months was the ideal time for the second dose, lowering complication rates like myocarditis and increasing antibody response. Telling people that data on the bivalent vaccine was crystal clear when it was authorized based on data from 8 mice, and to date, no randomized controlled trial has been conducted. And failing to speak out against the cruel and inhumane hospital visitation policies that prevented people from seeing their dying loved ones, a human rights violation. To be clear, public health officials are not wrong for making recommendations based on the knowledge that they had at the time. But that's not actually what happened. They were wrong because they refused to evolve their positions as the data became abundantly clear. For example, young, healthy people were essentially spared of this pandemic. They had an infection fatality rate no worse than influenza. In fact, ask anyone who's pushing COVID vaccines on healthy young people. Has any young, healthy child died in the United States of COVID in the last 3 years? Do you know? Do any of you know? The CDC director didn't know when she was asked at this Congress. The numbers have never been provided. Could be 2, could be 10, could be 25 kids over 3 years, far less than other common respiratory viruses. Germany did a study. It was 0 kids 5 through 11 years of age that died that were healthy in that entire country in the population study. So what are we doing? Using intense dogma, telling 50 million children they have to lose their livelihood of learning and being in school and school lunch programs and covering their faces based on what? This intense arrogance is what people are frustrated by, and they have a right to be upset right now. The data was abundant for a long time. We're not talking about making the best decision at the time with the information at hand. We're talking about ignoring data on natural immunity, over 160 studies now over 2 years, including a JAMA study that my team published out of Hopkins. Why didn't they didn't even do this study? My team had to go out and invite people who had the infection early on, and then a year and 2 years after the infection, see whether or not they had antibodies. Not a hard study to do. I too, Ranking Member Ruiz, am concerned about misinformation. The greatest perpetrator of misinformation during the pandemic has been the United States government. Misinformation that COVID was spread through surface transmission, that vaccinated immunity was far greater than natural immunity, that masks were effective. Now we have the definitive Cochrane review. What do you do with that review? Cochrane is the most authoritative evidence body in all of medicine and has been for decades. Do you just ignore it, not talk about it? That myocarditis was more common after the infection than the vaccine. Not true. It's 4 to 28 times more common after the vaccine. That young people benefit from a booster. Misinformation. Our 2 top experts on vaccines quit the FDA in protest over this particular issue, pushing boosters in young, healthy people. The data was never there. That's why the CDC never disclosed hospitalization rates among boosted Americans under age 50. The vaccine mandates would increase vaccination rates. The George Mason University study shows it didn't. It did one thing. It created never-vaxxers who are now not getting the childhood vaccines they need to get. Over and over again, we've seen something that goes far beyond using your best judgment with the information at hand. We've seen something which is unforgivable, and that is the weaponization of medical research itself. The CDC putting out their own shoddy studies, like their own study on natural immunity, looking at one state for 2 months, when they had data for years on all 50 states. Why did they only report that one sliver of data? Why did they salami slice the giant database? Because it gave them the result they wanted. Same with masking study. Well, the data has now caught up in giant systematic reviews, and the public health officials were intellectually dishonest. They lied to the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you for the invitation to address the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. I want to focus my remarks today on the need for an honest, scientifically minded evaluation of the COVID pandemic response. Though scientists and people vehemently disagreed about the wisdom of lockdowns, school closures, vaccine mandates and discrimination, masks, and so much else, there's near universal agreement that what we did failed. Official counts attribute more than 1 million deaths to COVID in the United States and almost 7 million worldwide. By early 2022, about 95% of Americans had contracted COVID, despite the harsh countermeasures in most states, including confinement of broad populations, business closures, cessation of religious and other gatherings, school closures, and widespread violation of civil liberties. Very clearly, these measures failed to protect Americans from COVID. This fact is confirmed by comprehensive Johns Hopkins University meta-analysis, which concluded that lockdowns had failed to contain the spread of COVID. At best, they temporarily protected the laptop class who could work from home without losing their jobs, perhaps 30% of the population, while being served by the working class. The pandemic response itself has wrought tremendous collateral harm. There's now broad agreement that the school closures in some states running for a year or more have set kids behind in ways that will lead them to worse outcomes as adults, including shorter, poorer lives. One peer-reviewed paper estimated that the spring 2020 closures alone may have cost American children millions of life years in expectation. These losses are unequally distributed, with poor and minority children suffering the worst learning losses. Hundreds of thousands of kids never returned to school when schools opened. Maybe the most perplexing sin of the public health establishment was that it abandoned an essential commitment to science. For example, why was the age gradient in COVID risk ignored in sending COVID-infected patients back to nursing homes early in the pandemic, where we knew the most vulnerable people resided? Why did public health authorities ignore clear scientific data that COVID infection-acquired immunity is as strong or stronger than vaccine-acquired immunity? Vaccine mandates forced many frontline workers, heroes who contracted COVID early in the pandemic while doing essential work, to choose between their careers and a vaccine that provides less protection than the natural immunity they already had. Many, faced with these anti-scientific choices, will never trust public health authorities again, even on vital topics such as the necessity of traditional childhood vaccines. Public health bureaucrats operate more like dictators than scientists during the pandemic, sealing themselves off from credible outside criticism. Consider, for instance, the treatment of scientific dissidents outside the government who contradicted public health dogma. In the earliest days of the pandemic, public health bureaucrats organized a cover-up of the hypothesis that COVID emerged as a result of a laboratory leak, calling scientists who proposed the idea conspiracy theorists. Only recently have official bodies started to admit the hypothesis is plausible and maybe even true, and certainly not a conspiracy. Where do the scientists whose careers were destroyed advancing the idea go to get their reputations back? When Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University here today, Sunetra Gupta, a professor at Oxford University, and I proposed a focused protection alternative, not a herd immunity alternative, to lockdowns in October 2020, then NIH director Francis Collins labeled the three of us fringe epidemiologists and engaged a media campaign to take down our proposal, to which tens of thousands of doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists endorsed, including a Nobel Prize winner. Under the banner of combating misinformation, government health agencies use their power to collaborate with social media companies to control the public conversation about science, COVID science, and policy. The pattern repeated itself throughout the pandemic, with science bureaucrats abusing their authority to create an illusion of scientific consensus in favor of destructive ideas when none existed. So the American people deserve answers to fundamental questions about the pandemic. On what empirical basis were schools closed? Did public health decision makers consider the harms of their policies as thoroughly as their putative benefits? Why did authorities ignore recovered immunity or failure of the vaccine to prevent disease transmission in recommending vaccine mandates and discriminatory vaccine policies? With such a litany of failure, the American people deserve an honest COVID commission to evaluate the response and document all the errors as well as the few successes. In 1986, when the U.S. faced the national tragedy of the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion, Congress created a commission with independent outside experts, including Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. His iconic demonstration of a faulty O-ring made brittle in the cold as the cause of the Challenger disaster led to fundamental reforms at NASA. The American people deserve a similar bipartisan, scientifically minded COVID-19 commission so the public health disaster of the last 3 years is not repeated. With Dr. Makari, Dr. Kulldorff, and 5 other epidemiologists, I've written a document called the Norfolk Group Blueprint, where we list 80 pages of questions that need to be answered, scientific questions, in a bipartisan, scientifically minded spirit to address the failure of the public health establishment during the pandemic. Thank you.
Now recognize Dr. Benjamin to give an opening statement.
Chairman Weintraub and Ranking Member Rhodes-Listen, thank you very much for allowing me to be here with you today. And members of the committee, thank you as well. I'm Georges Benjamin. I'm the Executive Director at the American Public Health Association. I'm an internist, but I really self-identify as an emergency physician who got dragged into public health. And let me say that I've been in this town for a long time, and I have probably been involved with every single public health emergency that we've had since I arrived here in 1983. And from my years addressing crisis and emergency situations, it's clear to me that the understanding of the facts around what, when, and how things happen is an essential first step to ensuring we are better prepared for the future, and I'm very glad the committee is looking to do that. In addition, though, let me just point out that the retrospective scope, docs in the room will understand that, many of those on the committee, is a very powerful tool. But we have to be incredibly careful that we do not review our past actions using what we know today while forgetting what we actually knew when we initially made critical decisions. That's very, very important. And I think the chairman has also said that as well. And while what we know today should indeed inform our future preparations, and I don't want anyone to leave this room thinking I don't believe that it should inform this, we must remember the limited information we had when we made those decisions are very, very important. And also the fact that our knowledge base in science continues to evolve over time. And so we do learn things over time. First of all, we created a safe and effective vaccine by every standard that we understand safe and efficacy today in record time, in absolutely record time. And we delivered that vaccine to many, many more people than any other vaccine we ever delivered in our nation. That doesn't mean there aren't some problems with that, but we were very, very successful in doing that. And we have done a phenomenal amount of research and studies through a variety of venues under the most strenuous circumstances and most difficult circumstances that we certainly had. I agree with my colleague here that after 9/11, I remember sitting in the HHS with others talking about what do we do next. And I remember President Bush signing legislation that actually created the 9/11 Commission. That commission did a wonderful product, which was able to aid Congress and then going back and figuring out what to do as we went forward. And so I would encourage us very much to create a 9/11 type commission. There are other leading experts that have called for such a commission. There's the COVID Commission Planning Group at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, who's done this call for in conjunction with the Johns Hopkins University. And the COVID Collaborative, of which APHA is a member, has also called for such a commission. We think that obviously doing that in a nonpartisan manner will help us get to the facts in a comprehensive way, and I think will aid Congress in your work and actually helping us figure out what some of those solutions are. I think as we go forward, one of the real challenges we're going to have is figuring out how we do this in a manner that respects everybody's voice, because that's very important. And that I think we all need to, first of all, what my mom once told me was to first listen and learn, and listen more than I speak. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take questions from members of the committee.
Well, thank you, Dr. Benjamin. Thank you all for your opening statements. And I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes and go to questions. And also some comments on the opening statement. I do say that, you know, if we didn't always search for better answers, we'd still be doing bloodlettings. And unfortunately, we got beyond that. But data is important, and I think that's one of the areas we clearly can improve, because that's what you base your decisions on, is data and studies. You know, we knew from the trials for the vaccine, which I would agree with you, Doctor, it was amazing we got something done in the amount of time that we did while the ship was clearly sinking. But we knew from the trials there that even people that were vaccinated got COVID. And fortunately, they usually did not get as sick, maybe not need to be hospitalized. We also recognized who was vulnerable. We also knew that vaccines produce variants, and we should be expecting that. So at first, you put the emergency use out, and it was for the most vulnerable. That's how we prioritized as the vaccines were being produced. Those that age-related comorbidities, et cetera. And I think we were really looking at the benefit versus the risk in that situation, then I think we got away from that. And in many cases, we got away from the elimination of the physician that is your physician that should be looking at data. And there were other things that are lessons learned too, for sure. You know, in one of my rural counties, sheriff called me and he said, Brad, I got a 71-year-old gentleman here. He has a painful hernia. He was in so much pain, they canceled his case. He took his life. And guess how many cases there were in the county at that time? 0. So, you know, does that seem right to us today? No, it doesn't. And we have to be able to be open to foreign data, especially when we feel it's a reliable country that's doing the studies appropriately. I also had a situation where a gentleman called me, one of my constituents, and he said, hey, they're making my son get vaccinated. What should I do? I said, how old is he? Is he healthy and everything? Yeah, he's fine. I said, well, look, we're worried about myocarditis. It usually happens after the second dose. If they're making him do it, maybe get 1 dose, but get a note from his doctor that to waive having the second dose. Well, that didn't stand up. But didn't stand up to who? A school board? It wasn't standing up because it was coming from a physician. So these are things that are concerned about. I took the vaccine, 2 doses of Pfizer in January of 21. In August of 21, I got COVID. You know why I knew? I couldn't smell garlic salt. That's the only reason I knew. I didn't get tested. It was beyond that. I remember having chills about a week and a half before. No one in my family got sick. But when I was going to Germany, they said, before you go, you got to get a booster. You can't go without a booster. I said, okay, let's check my antibodies and T cells. And that gave alarm. This is right here in the Capitol, right? Not with the physician, though, with the nurse. I said, let's check that. She goes, well, we can't do T cells, we'll do your antibodies. I said, okay, I want to get that before getting boosted. Strong number was 40. My number was 821. I don't know one physician that would look at that data and say, you need to get this booster. Because I would say, you better have a good reason as to why. So this is why we have a problem today. And I think too much of it is data and physician interaction with patients. One thing I learned was patients said, we just want to be educated, not indoctrinated. And that is, I think, a problem that we've had with the public health response. So I would like someone to just maybe briefly touch on the little time that we have, the balance of vaccine-acquired immunity and natural immunity. Whoever feels they're most prepared for that one.
Well, natural immunity was observed in 430 BC after the Athenian plague. Recovered individuals did get severe illness, and yet it was considered a conspiracy theory or something we couldn't trust or believe in because we didn't know the long-term protection. Well, we didn't know the long-term protection of the vaccines either. What we noticed, though, if we listened to practicing physicians on the ground, and if anybody asked physicians in ICUs, the first year and a half of the pandemic, have you ever seen somebody healthy recover from COVID and then come back and need a ventilator? I asked that question. Doctors around the country all said no. So what does that tell us? Now, the Great Barrington Declaration pointed out that there was a 1,000-fold difference between the old and the young in infection fatality rate. If you start looking at someone with a risk factor and someone who's young and healthy, it's a 100,000-fold difference. So why do we have the same policies for everybody? Now, we all bring our biases into COVID and COVID policy. The bias of all the people making the decisions, and let's be honest, it was a small group of people making all the decisions, a small, non-diverse, like-minded group making all the decisions. And they were HIV researchers. Nothing wrong with being an HIV researcher, but guess what? In HIV, there's no natural immunity. It's an infection of the immune system. And with HIV, they said 1,000,000 times over, everyone's at equal risk. Not so with COVID. So there were intense biases that we saw. Now, Dr. Fauci, responding to the intense public pressure from the scientific community to recognize natural immunity, as Europe did, decided to call 4 of his buddies and do a straw poll vote. Should we recognize natural immunity? This is now public information. And the attendees of that meeting were people who were relatively like-minded with mandates and other policies of Fauci. The vote was split 2-2, so he just decided to continue the party line of the government that if you have circulating antibodies that neutralize the virus, they're antibodies the government does not recognize unless they were derived from the vaccine.
Thank you. I might add to that that I was at a meeting at the White House under the Trump administration, and my takeaway with the people that were around the table on this topic was there weren't enough people at the table to address all the health issues that were taking place in America. And I think that's something we need to consider going forward. Now I'd like to recognize Dr. Ruiz for his questions.
Thank you. A crucial charge of the Select Subcommittee's mission is to conduct an objective analysis of the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic so that we can better prevent and prepare for future public health crises. One important way we can do this is by examining our actions during the early days of the pandemic when little was known about the coronavirus, its transmission, and the dangers of COVID-19. Dr. Benjamin, what lessons can we learn from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic to better prepare our nation for future public health threats?
I think there are several things we can do. First of all, let me take on the issue of naive immunity. We generally don't do that in medicine, particularly when we have a therapeutic option that will prevent it, for a bunch of reasons. Remember that some of the early information we had coming out of China was that about 20% of the people who got sick got really sick, particularly people with chronic diseases. And if you're in the communities of color, disproportionately you had some of those chronic diseases. So we knew early on that that would be a real challenge. Secondly, yeah, you get immunized, but you got to survive to be immunized. I don't want to make that dramatic statement, but that's true. That we did not really understand the risk corridor there. We were all kind of surprised that kids did kind of well, but there were some children that got that MSC, which was a multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And, you know, today we've got about 9,000 kids who had that. So, you know, we were concerned about that. But we were surprised early on that kids did better. Now, I guess we shouldn't have been. You know, kids have really robust immune systems. And so kids do better than older adults do, particularly the aged. Our immune systems wither as we get older. But nonetheless, that was some of the things we understood. We understood that, and you might remember this was our perception worldwide was this was a bad disease. This was not the flu. You may remember we were making that comparison, flu versus COVID. And so there was a great deal of concern about this early on. Now, we've learned a lot since then. We have learned that if you do get a naive infection, meaning you aren't immunized, and then if you get vaccinated, you have a really, really, really robust response. And that's great science, and I'm glad we're learning like that. But my historical practice and my advice to when I talk to patients and communities is to get vaccinated because I think that is still the one thing that we know works.
So having said that, a crucial component of our efforts to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic has been expanding access to safe vaccines that dramatically reduce the risk of severe disease. Under the Biden-Harris administration, more than 600 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine have been administered across the United States. According to the Commonwealth Fund, COVID-19 vaccines have saved more than 3 million lives and prevented 18.5 million hospitalizations in the United States. Unfortunately, there has been this misinformation regarding vaccines that has surged during the pandemic, polarizing one of the most safe and effective tools we have to protect people from infectious diseases. Dr. Benjamin, why is vaccine misinformation so dangerous, and what steps should Congress and this select subcommittee take to dispel it?
Yeah, because I think it erodes trust. It erodes trust in physicians, it erodes trust in our healthcare system. You know, one of the interesting things was in March and April of 2020, we were already seeing flyers being passed out in communities. We hadn't even gotten a vaccine yet, telling communities they shouldn't get vaccinated. telling minority communities that they should be concerned about these vaccines because the federal government was coming, and they were going to treat them like they treated them in Tuskegee, that there were microchips in the vaccine that they were going to get whenever the vaccine came out. And so all of those kinds of things eroded our trust,
Yeah.
and that was the problem.
On page 35 of the Norfolk Group's report references the Great Barrington Declaration of October 2020. Doctors Bhattacharya and Koldorf authored this declaration to call for a herd immunity strategy through widespread natural infection before a COVID-19 vaccine was developed. The Norfolk Group's report questions why federal public health officials are critical of the Great Barrington Declaration. So I want you to respond. Dr. Benjamin, your organization, more than a dozen others, joined together to, quote unquote, according to the headline, condemn the Great Barrington Declaration, noting it could lead to hundreds of thousands of preventable illnesses and deaths and would, quote, add greater risks in communities of color, unquote, who were disproportionately harmed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Herd immunity for a virus that we have yet to understand the full ramifications. Even now we are learning of this long COVID in a virus that we saw the R0 rate that could infect and hospitalize and severely cause great harm to a great load of population. That was the context in which we were working. So why is the premise of the Great Barrington Declaration so dangerous from a public health perspective?
Well, we disagree with the approach, and we disagree with it, with our respect to my colleagues, because we thought that it put more people at risk. We knew that, and I know there's going to be a big debate about whether or not we should have stayed home and locked down our society, but it saved lives. And we felt that deliberately exposing people to that infection, recognizing they were trying to understand a risk strategy, couldn't do it. In our society today, we have lots of kids that are nice and healthy, but we have kids on high-dose steroids. We have kids with autoimmune diseases, and those kids go see grandma. And our society is highly mobile, and we felt that strategy would not work in today's society, particularly because we're highly mobile and we have such a immune-compromised society. A lot because we physicians do what we do.
If we could wrap it up, that would be great. All right, thank you. We went over like 2 minutes, so. I next want to recognize myself for questions. First of all, I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here. And for the 3 witnesses on my left, I greatly appreciate that you stood up for what you believed in, even though you were vilified, censored, and it's very unfortunate that that happened, and I think we can learn a lesson from that. So, questions I have are for Dr. Bhattacharya, Kulov, and Macquarie. Dr. Li Meng Yan, who's a Chinese virologist, was recently on media, and she said she believes that COVID was intentionally released based on protocol and other surveillance. It would be impossible for the virus to be accidentally leaked from the lab. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, you 3.
I don't know for certain, but I think it's unlikely that this is the kind of virus that would be intentionally released. The evidence that I've seen suggests that the lab leak hypothesis is an active hypothesis, that it's quite possible that this was a lab leak as a result of gain-of-function work to try to predict the next pandemic, to try to get vaccines available for the next pandemic. I don't think that this has the characteristics of a bioweapon. I don't think this has the characteristics of something that would be intentionally leaked, certainly not in any ethical way. I also know that there's a lot of scientists that think it might also have been a natural origin. This is something that Congress absolutely needs to get to the bottom of, to get an answer to.
Thank you. My next question is, in a recent Energy and Commerce Oversight hearing, I asked the NIH director about the NIH's gross negligence in monitoring the EcoHealth Alliance grant and subgrant at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. After admitting that we might not have all of the information and research reports from the WIV and EcoHealth, he insisted that he was sure that the coronavirus research that the U.S. taxpayer dollars funded at WIV was completely unrelated to SARS-CoV-2. And I was wondering if any of the three of you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The reason this is even an issue is that it's embarrassing we funded the lab. If we had not funded the lab, 100% of Americans would say this is obvious, this is a no-brainer. The epicenter of the world is 5 miles from one of the only high-level virology labs in China. The doctors initially were arrested and forced to sign non-disclosure gag documents. The lab reports have been destroyed. They've not been turned over. The sequences reported from the lab to the NIH database were deleted by a request from Chinese scientists that called over early on and said, delete those sequences we put in the database. And two leading virologists, maybe the two top virologists in the United States, Dr. Michael Farzan from Scripps and Dr. Robert Gary from Tulane, told Dr. Fauci on his emergency call in January of 2020 when he was scrambling soon after learning that the NIH was funding the lab, they both said that it was likely from the lab. Both scientists changed their tunes days later in the media, and then both scientists received $9 million subsequent in funding from the NIH. It's a no-brainer that it came from the lab. I mean, at this point, it's impossible to acquire any more information, and if you did, it would only be affirmative.
So when I asked the NIH director about this, and he said there's no way that it could have been coronavirus 2 that was being funded from the lab, and he said it's like comparing a human to a cow because of the sequence. But then I asked, well, how do you know that? Because we didn't get the data from China. So do you understand what I'm trying to say? Like, we didn't get the data, so how does he know that it's not coronavirus 2?
There's no way he could have known. There's no way he could have known the answer to that question,
All
especially
right.
since the Chinese lab didn't release the data.
Thank you. My next question has to do with a statement President Biden said in July 16, 2021. He said, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated, and they're killing people. And so I was wondering if any of the three of you have any comments on that.
Well, this was a pandemic for every American and also for the whole world. And as soon as we knew that the COVID virus hit Italy and Iran, which was the first two major epicenters outside of Wuhan or outside of China, it was clear that this was going to reach every part of the world. And by nature of a virus like this, it was also clear that it would only stop once we reach herd immunity by a combination of natural immunity and vaccine-induced immunity. So to only say that it's a pandemic of one group but not another thing, is a very decisive way of putting it, and it's not.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think we all can agree on some things, that the coronavirus pandemic upended our nation, and that it's critical that we get the facts to ensure our nation's better prepared to address future health threats. I'm very honored, by the way, to be on this committee. Both our chair and ranking are gone right now, but I'm glad to be here with all of my colleagues because I think it's really important we have an honest conversation, know where we're going, and be prepared for the next pandemic if it's going to happen, which unfortunately it is going to happen. My home state of Michigan was especially hit hard by the pandemic. It set records for hospitalization, was hit with infection surges that devastated our communities, overwhelmed our healthcare sector, and stole lives. So to better prepare to address threats to public health, we must have an objective understanding of where the federal government succeeded and how its response could have improved. I'm not sure this report is the best place to start, but I'm going to go to vaccines. We know that vaccines protect against severe COVID and limit hospitalizations. Under the Biden administration, over 600 million vaccines have been distributed, and this has allowed us, I do believe, to enter a new phase in our nation's recovery. But I'm going to probably surprise you and tell you I understand vaccine hesitancy more than most. I got Guillain-Barré from a swine flu shot. So if you didn't think I was scared, I won't use the word, to get it, I was. And I spent a lot of time researching it and probably was one of the last members in the House to get it. But I did get it. And I ultimately, I got COVID last December, so I got it later than everybody else did, but I did end up in the hospital. Vaccines, we're beginning to have outbreaks in communities, and that worries me too. So Dr. Benjamin, what does the science tell us? Two things regarding the safety and the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines, and how do we address people's public health worries now about getting vaccines at all?
Yeah. Well, we know for sure that these vaccines reduce your risk, and I think that's very important. This is all about risk reduction. Reduce your risk from getting COVID in the first place. It does reduce your risk somewhat from even spreading the disease. It's not as good at that, but it's most effective at making sure people don't get really sick and die from COVID. And I think we have to be honest with people that vaccines, like any therapeutic, room without society back together, and we're able to do that because of the vaccines.
So we're going to help rebuild trust. Let's talk about misinformation for a moment, too. Town halls every other week. And I was shocked by the misinformation and conspiracy theories that were encountered, ranging from mischaracterization of the disease, false treatments. I know people that were getting medicine that almost killed them that were in the hospital, inaccuracies about protective measures. The fact of the matter is this misinformation had damaging and deadly consequences. Dr. Benjamin, what steps can Congress take to address misinformation in the public health context? And how do we communicate with people? And how do they know who to believe these days?
Yeah, well, clearly we all need to follow the science. And we need to speak what we know and be real clear. I try very hard when I don't know something to say I don't know it. But tell people that this is what we know today. And we just need to do a much, much better job of that. And so what Congress can do is provide the leadership by speaking to the science, supporting more scientific discovery, and engaging effectively in good risk communication back home to your communities.
I yield back. I'm out of time.
I now recognize Dr. McCormick from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
I respectfully would say I'm from Georgia. But with that said, sir, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Texas. First of all, appreciate you all being here, and I would say I'll just make the suggestion that maybe the best thing Congress and government could do is stay out of medicine. Leave this to the physicians. Now, I know you guys have better academic acumen than I do. I admit that fully. I bet you because of your prestige and the fact that you're sitting before us, you probably did a lot better in school than I did. December 28th. Dr. Benjamin, you made some astute observations, and you made some recommendations. When, sir, was the last time you saw a patient in the ER?
Yeah, it's been 1995.
1995. Okay, thank you. But still, you make recommendations, and one of the things that disturbed me greatly about this pandemic is that people who are experts, who have never seen a patient for COVID, were telling physicians like myself, who saw thousands of patients, that I could not speak and that I should be censored, and that if I had a disagreement with you, because I do disagree. I think booster, first of all, let me tell you some things that might surprise you. I was one of the first people in America to get the original series of shots. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. To show in a novel virus for people who are at high risk of being exposed, and we didn't know about the age variants that much at the time. We didn't know how it was going to affect us because different diseases affect us differently. I got the vaccination gladly. But as the data developed, and even as we sort ourselves out amongst physicians of liberals and conservative physicians, I saw a bias even amongst physicians that went against scientific data because we politicized this, because we had the government weigh in on it instead of letting physicians treat patients. And that's our biggest and most egregious insult to medicine right there. For the first time, government was able to tell us what's right and wrong, was able to tell me as a physician that my experience didn't matter. And that if I disagree with you and I said, you know what, that booster shot really isn't showing any significant benefit as science has now proven, and yet here people say, yes, you should still get the booster, even though it's not beneficial, and we don't even know all the side effects. As a matter of fact, I would make the argument right now, right here on TV, as a congressman who's also a recent physician and still qualified to treat patients, that we do more harm than good by treating people with booster shots right now. If you have immunity and you give an infection to somebody, what happens? You have an immune response. That's basic medicine. Every physician would agree on that. If you give somebody a exposure to a pathogen, whether it's a live pathogen or not, you're going to have a hyperimmune response sometimes. Sometimes that happens with antibiotics, by the way. That's why we don't give antibiotics that aren't needed. If you don't need something, why are we giving it? If you have immunity, why are we recommending it? That's my question to you as a disagreeing physician.
I love to disagree with docs. And I'm fully licensed and quite clinically still competent. And I hear you. And I'm happy to give Congress my list of things that I think Congress should stay out of the business of physicians. And I absolutely agree with you. And I'm happy to give you that list, but I'll give it to you privately.
Do you think that anybody should be censored? We talked about censorship, and I know this is not supposed to be
No,
partisan.
sir. Nobody should be censored.
Thank you. Everybody here has heard of Dr. Lister. Everybody's probably heard about President Garfield. It was a dissenting opinion that you should wash your hands in between patients, and the fact that physicians who were the standard of their time, who infected the president and killed him, are the ones who did bad medicine. The only progress we make in medicine is through dissent. And the biggest problem that government did was by censoring physicians who dissented. And several of them are right here in front of us who've been done harm. I was one of those physicians who was taken off the internet because I was spreading misinformation, which now shows to be factual. The fact is, you agree, and you're on the different side of the problem equation than I am. But I'm happy that you and I agree on one thing, that physicians, professionals who do our job with good faith, should never be censored, not by a government, not by the internet, not by anybody else, because we're the ones putting our lives on the line to treat the patients the best way we know how. With that said, would you tell me why you still, based on the evidence that the CDC has published and many other studies have studied, that you still recommend a booster shot to immune people?
The studies that I've looked at, I'm very comfortable that the boosters work and enhance your immune status.
So if you're immune, you think they should still get a booster shot?
We do with lots of diseases. So we do with flu. As you see your immune status comes down, we give you a boost, increase it up. We do it with measles, mumps, and rubella.
I would say that I don't give a chicken pox shot to a 2-year-old that's already had chicken pox. I think that would be a bad case. So anyways, I would disagree with you, and I would, once again, I'll yield because I know I'm going over time now, but thank you for your response.
Now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I definitely want to thank all of our distinguished guests and certainly all of our witnesses. I know that we're going to have many conversations at this subcommittee. It's an honor and a pleasure to serve with everybody with a lot of important work ahead as we prepare for what will be the next pandemic. We know pandemics will continue to impact the United States, our country. Now, before joining Congress, I was the mayor of Long Beach, California. It's one of the largest cities in California. And so I lived and led through the early days of the pandemic. I'm proud that our community was the first California city to vaccinate teachers. We were the first California city to vaccinate most of our seniors in our nursing homes. And we were the largest school district to reopen our schools because we had vaccinated teachers early on during the pandemic. In fact, President Biden and the White House called our response, quote, a national model, and I'm really proud of the work that our public health officials, doctors, and medical personnel did on the ground every single day. And I think we should also be very clear about what this pandemic is and what we're talking about today. It's the single largest loss of life event in the modern era. We've lost over 1 million Americans to this horrific virus, and it's a tragedy that we've all lived through. We've lost in my city alone over 1,300 members of our own community. I lost my mother to the pandemic. I lost my stepfather to the pandemic. Now, my mom was a healthcare worker who worked in clinics, who got the virus, and then, of course, unfortunately, my stepfather also got the virus. And both of them, by the way, would have been some of the first people to receive the vaccine, but the vaccine, of course, wasn't available at that time. And so I deeply care very personally about the work of this committee and our country's ability to take on the next pandemic. There's been a lot of discussion about mistakes that were made, and I think it's important to note that in any crisis, mistakes are going to be made. We had an enormous crisis happening here and across the world. When we make mistakes, we learn from them, we adjust. It's okay to be angry at the scale of the mistakes, and to then learn, move on, and prepare for the next crisis that we may have in our country. What's not okay to me, and it's really not acceptable to folks that have lost individuals or folks within the healthcare community, is to peddle half-truths or conspiracy theories, and certainly to advance misinformation for political gain. Now, I've heard members of this very committee more interested in mistruths or vaccine hesitancy than on actually focusing on pandemic prevention and learning from our mistakes and implementing them across our government. Now, we've talked a lot about a lot of mistakes, and I think that's true. I remember early on when the pandemic first happened, trying to get tests, trying to get support from the Trump administration, none of which was pretty united on what has worked and what hasn't worked. What has cost many lives and continues to cost lives is misinformation, a lot of which we actually hear in the U.S. Congress. Now, Dr. Benjamin, would you agree it's safe to say that misinformation has been and continues to be a public health threat?
It's a major public health threat and continues to be so.
And would you also agree that people with large public platforms who has spread misinformation actually have made the pandemic worse?
I think there are many people out there who have a large bullhorn who have made it worse, and I think that is a real challenge we have to figure out how we address.
And would you agree that members that have large public platforms, including members of Congress, should not be essentially encouraging folks to not get vaccinated, which is actually happening by some members of this very committee?
Well, let me put it this way. I have a large public platform as a head of the largest public health association on the planet, and I am very, very careful what I say and how I say it in order to not be misconstrued. And
I now recognize Dr. Jackson, who truly is from Texas, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Benjamin, I just want to ask you a real quick question. As a well-documented advocate for the mass vaccination of not only adults but young children, are you still advocating, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this, that young, healthy children as young as 6 months of age should still receive the vaccine?
yes, sir, I am.
Okay, and so you think that, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but you think that anyone in this country, any American, regardless of age, regardless of whether they're healthy or non-healthy, whether they're immunocompromised or non-immunocompromised, whether they have comorbidities or not, everyone should get the vaccine?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, you know, this is one of the things that disturbs me the most as a physician, is that we are approaching this vaccine. I talk about the public health authorities in this country, are approaching this vaccine like it's any other childhood vaccine. This is a vaccine that was developed by mRNA technology. We have no long-term studies, despite the constant, implications or suggestions by those that are suggesting that everyone should get this vaccine, that these studies exist. There are no studies on the long-term consequences of receiving this vaccine. It would not be possible to have those. It's just that they're not possible. So I hear people say all the time, and they use that as an excuse to say these vaccines are completely safe. I'm pretty disturbed at this particular point that we are advocating for young, healthy children who essentially have no risk of serious illness or hospitalization, and certainly not death from this vaccine, to continue to push this as a normal childhood vaccine. As Dr. McCormick had mentioned earlier, I'm not an anti-vaxxer either. I got the vaccine myself. I had both of them. I got all my children vaccinated when they were growing up, all the childhood vaccines that they were supposed to get. This vaccine is completely different, and I think that it's a shame that we're treating it the same way we are now. Now, I want to ask you a question. Sir, are you at all alarmed by the recent spike in myocarditis and cardiovascular disease in young, otherwise healthy children that have received this vaccine, which is now a documented side effect of the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, we know that it's rare, first of all. And secondly, let me point one other thing. Where we are with these vaccines, the same place we were when we had the first polio vaccine, the first MMR vaccine, first tetanus vaccine.
Yes, but those were illnesses where children were. The Food and Drug Administration asked a federal judge for permission to make the public wait until 2096 to disclose all of the data it relied upon to license the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Benjamin, in your opinion, why would the FDA need 75 years to release such critical information to the public? What do you think the hesitation here is?
I have absolutely no idea.
You don't think that's reasonable either?
I think we ought to figure out why they want to hold on to it.
Well, I think we should figure that out too.
Long
It
period
seems
of time.
completely unreasonable why they need 75 years to release such information unless they were covering up something. Okay. All right. Well, look, I will say, and no disrespect, sir, but you were and you still are the director of the American Public Health Association. And I think one of the biggest travesties, one of the biggest disasters from this COVID disaster was what we have now is a complete lack of trust and confidence in the public health sector, complete lack. And that's due to a coordinated spread of misinformation and disinformation that was for political gain for the most part, and a lot of part by public health officials like yourself, and to some extent by people who didn't have any medical background whatsoever. They were misrepresenting those risks and treating all Americans, as I said, of all ages, as if they had the same risks from COVID, which is completely not true. There's misinformation regarding the long-term safety of the vaccine, as I mentioned, claiming it was science backing their decisions to, or they're backing their statements saying this, which we know that science does not exist. There's misinformation regarding masking, social distancing, the authoritarian lockdowns, harm to the education and the well-being of our children, natural immunity, as we've discussed, the potential therapeutics, many of which we know had safety profiles, and the list goes on and on. I will say to you that I think that as I said, with no disrespect, you are a very strange witness for the minority to bring before this committee when I think that one of the biggest failures of this entire COVID fiasco has been the complete lack of trust and confidence that the American people now have in the public health sector. Thank you. With that, I yield back, sir.
I now recognize Ms. Ross from North Carolina for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm not a doctor, so you guys are probably going to be happy about that, but my dad is a doctor. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed how unprepared the United States and the rest of the world are for large-scale public health emergencies. And it's critical that we learn from this experience and use our knowledge and resources to prepare for and prevent similar disasters in the future. For years before the onset of the current pandemic, academic, scientific, and policy institutions warned of the potentially devastating impacts of a global pandemic. As far back as 2012, the Rand Corporation concluded that pandemics were capable of destroying America's way of life. In the years following, the U.S. intelligence community cautioned in their annual worldwide threat assessment that pandemics can cause political and economic upheaval. Our goal today should be to address the systemic gaps that left us in the nation but around the world. We must ensure that we take basic steps to protect our own citizens. For example, my state of North Carolina has refused to expand Medicaid, leaving hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians without health insurance and more vulnerable to their health risks. This is one area where we worked to address in the American Rescue Plan by providing states with new financial incentives to expand Medicaid. Wake County, where I'm from, in the Research Triangle, stepped up to ensure that its residents had easy access to critical services, including free testing in multiple locations, vaccinations, personal protective equipment, and more. I'm proud of the local government officials, nonprofits, and regular Americans who work together to meet the needs of our district. But we can't depend just on local strategies. We need a national strategy and a global strategy. We have to create a comprehensive federal plan. We also need to address staffing shortages in our healthcare. Right now, there are people who have left the healthcare profession because of the pandemic, and we aren't getting them incentives and new people into the healthcare profession. And that is something this committee should address. So, What I would like to do first is basically say, clearly, the world and we were unprepared for the COVID pandemic. And I'd like to know what kind of research and initiatives we should invest in to prevent and get ahead of future pandemics. And I can start with Dr. Benjamin, but I would love to hear from the entire panel.
Let me just say that I know the NIH just rolled out a strategic plan for research. I would encourage Congress to support that. It has 5 priorities, and they go in anyways to range from fundamental knowledge to actually implementation science. I think it's a good plan, and again, I would just encourage Congress to do that. My colleagues here have some ideas as well, and some of their research ideas absolutely ought to be looked at. No idea should be taken off the table.
Okay, to the other doctors.
Can I say that since it's such a short time, the key thing is to let the discussion happen, to not censor outside voices. I personally have faced censorship from government sources during the pandemic, including, and as well as like slander and denigration. Even during this committee hearing, we've heard people mischaracterize my ideas. You need to involve outside voices respectfully in order to get the full set of people, doctors certainly, but also outside scientists who disagree, at the table during the time the decisions are made, or else bad decisions will get made, just as they were during this pandemic.
Okay. Briefly, I do have one other question, so briefly.
So I think there's one Western country who did very well during the pandemic, and that was Sweden, who had a left-wing government at the time, run by the Social Democrats. They did not lock down. They had mostly voluntary measures. They didn't always succeed in protecting the older, but they did a decent job doing it. And we now know the result is that Sweden had less COVID deaths than most other countries in Europe. And the more important measure is actually excess death. And Sweden has, together with other Scandinavian countries who also had a very light approach to this, the least excess death in the world. So we know that they did a very good strategy, and that was done by a leftist government. So it's not a right or leftist things.
Yes.
So,
Reclaiming my time, Sweden also provides health care to everyone. And that goes back to my point about Medicaid not being available throughout this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I now recognize Ms. Green for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The response to COVID-19 was devastating to our country, and it's going to be years before we really know the effects and the outcome on our society, and especially on our children. What it did to our children's math and reading levels is horrific. School closures brought them to the lowest levels in years. English 8th graders' math proficiency dropped by 7 points. Reading levels dropped by 2 points. But children in schools that were locked down saw declines in test scores up to 3 times greater than districts that had in-person learning for the majority of the school year. Children truly suffered, and masks were completely child abuse. Suicides. It was unbelievable to hear the numbers of suicides, but it was devastating to hear suicide numbers in young people. The largest increase in the rate of suicides occurred among males ages 15 to 24, an 8% increase. Suicide rates also increased for males ages 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and 65 to 74. But suicides were up at much higher levels because of the shutdowns. Vaccines versus natural immunity. This was something that we've never seen before. The data did not lie. Natural immunity is something that should have been trusted, but for some reason, all common sense and all knowledge went out the window. Researchers found that the vaccinated are at least twice as likely to be infected with COVID as the unvaccinated, and those with natural immunity. But as of February 17, 2023, here's what is shocking to me. There are 1,524,481, this is over 1 million, 1.5 million adverse COVID vaccine effects reported on the VAERS system. And no one seems to want to investigate what these vaccine injuries and deaths are all about. And that's something that cannot be ignored. Through EcoHealth Alliance at the Wuhan lab in China, the American people are finally saying, well, it's good that everyone is acknowledging what we knew all along, and it cannot be ignored any longer. There's something very interesting to me. Dr. Bhattacharya, you took to Twitter and opened an account, and you have a bio that speaks for itself. You took your expertise in your field to try to between the old and the young. Tweet that got you permanently banned on Twitter.
So I was put on a trends blacklist. I think that was my second tweet. The day I joined Twitter, I was placed on a trends blacklist by Twitter, which made sure that that a limited set of my followers would see my tweets, but nobody else would.
So you were placed on a blacklist, and this is because our government was coordinating with Twitter to silence not only people like me, and I'm not a doctor, but I am a member of Congress, and they permanently banned my account for a year for just quoting CDC statistics and VAERS numbers. But they silenced your freedom of speech and tried to stop your expertise from being told to the public. And what's worse, our government decided that they were going to be the ones that locked down our country and dictated how we would respond to this. So you were able to go back to Twitter. You got your Twitter account back. Congratulations.
I did. Although, I mean, I was never banned from Twitter. What happened was that I was put on a blacklist so that my tweets didn't see an audience outside of just my followers. And I agree with you. I think it was at the behest of government requests, because there's a lawsuit that I've been involved with brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices against the Biden administration that have documented a dozen federal agencies telling social media companies what to censor and who to censor in many cases.
Let me follow up with one last question. What
Wanted the illusion that their ideas were a consensus when they were not. That my ideas were actually, it shattered the idea there actually was a scientific consensus around lockdowns, around school closures, around a whole host of policies that have done tremendous damage. And scientific bureaucrats did not want that idea that there were people, reasonable people on the outside that disagreed with them.
Well, I think history is proving you to be right. All of you gentlemen, thank you very much.
Now recognize California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a super important select committee to actually try to understand what happened, what worked, what didn't work, what mistakes were made. I'm a general internist by training, was chief medical officer for Sacramento County staff with public health background, have done a ton of global health security work and pandemic preparedness work, and chaired the first hearing in Congress, House and Senate on at that time, the novel coronavirus. So fairly early on was paying attention. A lot of the points that both sides bring up are valid. I mean, early on, there were real conversations about bifurcating treatment to protect our older Americans, while actually allowing younger Americans to get naturally infected. That was legitimate, folks that are well respected. We obviously didn't go in that direction. I think we ought to understand, what the impact of that was. I do believe in vaccines. I have gotten my booster and my bivalent booster. But I also understand that the vaccine mandate, I think in an unexpected way, there was dramatic pushback in the American public. Was that the right approach? Was there a better way to encourage folks to get vaccinated? I don't know, but I think we ought to understand that. We ought to understand the net impact of the vaccine. We ought to understand the spillover. Is it going to negatively impact our young people in America who may not, certainly, there are unanswered questions that I don't have. Early on, Japan didn't shut down dramatically. Older population, dense population, they were still riding their subways. We didn't see dramatic COVID in Japan. I'd like to understand why that was different than New York, another densely packed city. Was it a different variant? Was it cultural issues of masking, bowing, not shaking hands? Was there crossover immunity from SARS, MERS, other things? legitimately, I think we ought to understand that to better inform how we move forward. I think those are super important studies. We could do studies. We know, the state of Florida took a very different approach to, mask mandates and shutdowns, et cetera, versus, my home state of California. We ought to study, we ought to do a retrospective study looking at how different cities, different states approach this and use that to inform how we move forward. Clearly there's a logic that, wearing a mask for respiratory transmitted disease would probably reduce particulate infection. That makes sense. Did the mask mandate work? Did it not work? Dr. McCary, you cited the Cochrane report. Obviously, that's one conclusion. I think we ought to, maybe you have to have a certain level of penetration of mask work. I don't know the answer to that question, but those are all legitimate questions for us to ask and research. Dr. Kuldorf, Sweden took a different approach. We ought to, study that, compare it to what we're doing here. Clearly, closing schools down had a net negative impact on our kids. We ought to understand what that impact is. We ought to understand the long-term effects of that impact, because we may find ourselves in another pandemic. We're not totally out of this pandemic because we're seeing the irresponsibility that's taking place in China right now, where zero COVID at least was a policy. What they're doing right now is reckless, where you may get a new variant coming out of this wide open policy. I don't think it'll happen, but we ought to use that to inform how we approach future potential pandemics. So, I'm very open to going back, looking backwards and getting a sense of what worked, what didn't work, and using that to inform policy going forward. It shouldn't just be the government. It should be academia. It should be science-based. It should be fact-based. As doctors, we all, have had to do morbidity and mortality rounds where we've had to admit our mistakes, because that's how you get better. You actually admit the mistakes, you learn from the mistakes, and then you use that to move forward. So there are lots of questions that I still would like to learn about, COVID-19, to help inform how we approach the next pandemic and what we should do. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to a lot of the questions on this committee. And again, I think this is super important for us to take a look at.
Thank you, and I kick off this important investigation over the next several months. And it's refreshing to hear your voice again, and anyway, so thank you for being here. Thank you for being here to testify. One of the comments that was made was that the vast majority of medical professionals believe such and so a way, and I could understand why one would think that when that's been the only voice that's been allowed to talk for the last couple of years. Why one might think it was very monolithic, but I don't think that's been the case at all, and you guys have been testament to that, or at least have tried to be. So, we were told that the vaccines would keep people from getting COVID. That was not true. Is that correct? The vaccines would stop transmission. That was also not true. We even had government officials telling people, and very urgently, like, you don't love your kids, you don't love your neighbor if you don't get vaccinated. And yet the big talking points as to why everybody was supposed to and why we had these mandates and lockdowns was just false. Dr. Bhattacharya, I wanted to ask you, you had tweeted once, said, it's not just that Fauci and company got the facts about immunity after COVID recovery wrong. They used the vast power of the government to censor and marginalize those who got the facts right. I wanted to see if you could expand on that, because you were actually personally targeted in this as well. Is that correct?
So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the NIH director at the time, Francis Collins, labeled me, Senator Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff fringe epidemiologists. On topic after topic where there was legitimate outside critique of government positions, specifically of positions held by scientific bureaucrats like Francis Collins and Tony Fauci, they used their power over the press and the power of the government to marginalize those voices and exclude them, to create this sort of aura that we're saying something inconsistent with the scientific evidence, even though peer-reviewed published literature supported our positions. And on vaccine, on immunity after COVID recovery, it is incontrovertible that after you are recovered from COVID, you have substantial protection both against infection, at least until the next variant, and also almost probably near permanent protection against severe disease on reinfection. That was incontrovertible and known very early on in 2020, and yet that was marginalized during the discussion over vaccine mandates.
Yeah, and I think everybody gives a little latitude for the first couple months, but we knew a lot of this pretty early on, or at least had early indicators, yet that data was silenced. Dr. McCary, you said there was a 1,000-fold difference in the age, and we knew that early on. How early on? And that there was very little impact on children by comparison. You said that the U.S. government was the greatest purveyor of misinformation, specifically pointing out the CDC. I was wondering if you could speak to how early we knew some of this data compared to the information that was coming out. And then you specifically mentioned the CDC, yet we continue to see the CDC putting, for example, the COVID vaccine on the schedule for kids, which when you look at programs for Head Start and where it's highly pushed to have these vaccines to be able to participate in some of these other programs, there could also be another effect there, secondary effect to that. Could you speak to that and then your take on CDC requiring this for kids?
The CDC and the FDA and people at the NIH made up their mind before the trials were completed. They decided babies were going to get vaccines before the study was done, and when it came out, it found no statistically significant difference in efficacy between the two groups, and they just authorized it anyway. Why are we even doing trials? Why do we even have an FDA? Why not just have King Fauci decree that everyone's going to need this? And public health excluded anyone who had a different opinion. Ask any one of us that had different opinions than the establishment if we were invited ever to the Public Health Association or university forums. We had published collectively 400 articles on COVID, including peer review articles in JAMA, and yet we were excluded. So of course it looks like there's a consensus. But do you know that 40% of rural pediatricians in America do not recommend the COVID vaccine? How would you know that? That's a number that comes from a CDC discussion forum. We talk about vaccines as if it's all or nothing. You got to be all or nothing, like it's a religion. Does that mean does that mean all of you get the anthrax vaccine? Does it mean you get vaccines where the risk-benefit ratio isn't there? How about we just be honest? I'm not anti-vaccine in any group. I just like to see the data for boosters in young people or for babies to get it. Public health officials and the CDC are proposing that a 12-year-old little girl get 65 COVID vaccines in her average lifetime, in that average lifespan. Based on what? How about we see the data? Where did we forget the scientific process altogether? And top scientists at NIAID, the silenced, as I wrote about in the Free Press with Barry Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Benjamin, early on in the pandemic, Hawaii identified the need to have timely, accurate data available to both make decisions and direct resources. And while it can always be improved, what we found is accurate data really helped us identify disproportionately impacted populations, in particular Native Hawaiians, our Kofa population, Pacific Islanders. And knowing the impact on these populations, we were able to combat misinformation that was out there around both transmission and vaccination and reach out and culturally overall data infrastructure. Our ability to collect data and disaggregate that data on affected populations so we can make better decisions going forward on where to send resources to and those that are being impacted.
Yeah, one of the things COVID did do was expose for all of us to see the age and insufficiency of our health information technology infrastructure. And our data infrastructure. You know, we don't have a single patient identifier. We don't have any common definitions for a lot of the data that we send. Other industry, we know the technology is there. I mean, right now, if I wanted to order probably a late lunch for the committee here, I could go to my iPhone and go to DoorDash and feed you all, and an Uber or somebody would bring it here. Want to get an EKG across the street? Can't do it in many systems. So we have a lot of work to do to build that data infrastructure. And part of the problem we had with that disparity issue was, you know, when you're sending a piece of paper handwritten by fax machine, 3 people away, they got to then reconstruct that information and record it in by hand, and it often doesn't have race, ethnicity, gender, any of the data that you needed. So we knew that we were having these disparities by practice and by phone calls, but we didn't have that data put together quickly, and that was one of our problems.
Absolutely, it's definitely a shortcoming. And today we've heard a lot of fact and fiction about what saves lives and what endangers lives. And where I think we can all hopefully agree is that access to healthcare, just even being able to see a doctor and get help, that saves lives. And that was not equal across our communities and constituencies. We cannot walk away from this unprecedented moment in our history without learning that harsh lesson that gaps in our healthcare system, underserved populations, vulnerable communities that do not have access to health care, vaccinations, treatments, that cost lives. What has COVID taught us regarding health equity in our communities and how we should go forward in terms of prioritizing, boosting up that public health infrastructure?
2 things. One, clearly, the health insurance coverage matters, and that we as a nation need to get a system with everyone in and no one out. I did not call for single payer. I said a universal access system. You folks will figure it out. In public health, IT, data, workforce, research capacity, communication, risk communication skills, the whole battle.
Absolutely. And just finally, Dr. Benjamin, again, we've had a lot of talk about all kinds of things regarding this vaccination, again, facts and fiction. But I really want to ask you, how has the Biden-Harris administration's vaccine policy saved lives in this country, everyday Americans, our friends, our neighbors, our families?
No, I'm very proud of the work that this administration has done to you know, save lives. I think they've been focused. I think they've been structured. Let me say one other thing. I am very, very proud of the work of the public health community. I am proud of them. I trust them. And I would disagree. I believe that the vast...
Thank you. And now I recognize Dr. Joyce for 5 minutes. And they just called votes, so we'll try to keep this moving along.
Thank you for yielding, Chairman Winstrup. And for our witnesses for appearing today, I'd like to echo what you've heard from other members on this panel, that we are here today to conduct a thorough and comprehensive look at the response in the United States to the COVID-19 pandemic and identify the policies that must be changed to ensure that we do not repeat the mistakes that were made at government levels. So I listened to what my colleagues across the aisle, the questions they asked. I listened to the comments they made. I heard that what I see in hospitals and nursing homes at home are shortage of nurses, dietitians, respiratory aides to treat and care for patients. And that exists primarily because those healthcare workers do not trust what they've heard from the administration, do not trust what they've heard from the NIH and CDC. Many of those individuals recognize that they have acquired immunity. They have natural immunity because they've been exposed to and recovered from COVID. So my question first for you, Dr. McCary, is, do you feel that acquired immunity to COVID should substitute for a requirement for a COVID vaccine?
You know, I think people deserve, they're extremely low risk. It doesn't make sense. If they're a young, healthy child, it doesn't make sense. There's never been any data to support that. But if they are high risk and immunosuppressed, they can make that decision, and I would recommend it. So,
and our American freedoms allow us to make that decision. Dr. Bhattacharya, do you feel that individuals should be mandated that their children receive vaccines that are not yet FDA approved?
No.
Do you feel that that has contributed to the rise in ability for parents to have the impact to make that decision for what's important for their own children?
I've seen a rise in vaccine hesitancy for essential vaccines like measles, DPT, that's quite alarming. And I think a lot of that hesitancy is due to the mandates and due to the force, rather than using ethical principles like informed consent. This mandate has demolished trust in vaccines more broadly, and I think it's quite alarming.
Dr. McCarry, you're at Johns Hopkins Hospital, where I spent a lot of time as well, and I recognize that the esteemed institution has seen a rise in the number of delayed diagnosis. Individuals presenting with metastatic colon cancer, metastatic breast cancer, metastatic prostate cancer. Do you feel that the fear of COVID exposure required individuals to step back from receiving the basic medical screening tests that would have prevented them from having metastatic and often deadly disease?
People have a distorted perception of risk. A Stanford study found that bicyclers in Palo Alto by the Stanford campus, 43% of them were wearing a mask while biking outside, but only 17% were wearing a helmet. People have a distorted perception of risk, and they've bought into this absolutism. As a physician, you got to just present risks. For example, should pregnant women get the vaccine? Is it safe in pregnancy? You know what? The answer is probably, but we don't have good data. That's what we should be telling women, not mandating it as a condition for them to be a nurse in the hospital and then firing them if they don't have it, even though they have circulating antibodies from natural infection, but they are antibodies that Dr. Fauci does not recognize.
Do you feel
humility among physicians instead of the absolutism and the dogma when we should have simply said the right answer, we don't know, instead of you must do X, Y, or Z?
Do you feel that that absolutism, your term, has really severed the ties of respect from American patients, from American medical institutions, from the CDC, from the NIH?
It'll take decades to restore some of this damaged trust.
Hopefully this committee and our work will allow us to take this information and give the guidance so that we can recover from that mistrust. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I again thank the witnesses for being present here today. I thank you for your important input.
Thank you.
Now recognize Dr. Miller Meeks for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank our witnesses for being here. Dr. Benjamin, I want to thank you as a fellow public health official. So many of you know that I'm a physician. I'm also a former director of the Iowa Department of Public Health. And imagine my first foray into Congress, sitting on this select subcommittee for the past 2 years, when I had the opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky, and then public health directors, to ask them about infection-acquired immunity and herd immunity. And you would have thought that that was a novel concept, as novel as SARS-CoV-2. So in asking this question and asking individuals, I actually put forward a bill mandating that all insurances, both public and private, cover for testing for humoral antibodies and also T-cell antibodies, trying to push this issue that if you have immunity, which, can you all just answer for me quickly, what's the purpose of a vaccine? Dr. Koldroff? Why do we vaccinate people?
Well, vaccine is sort of a substitute for natural immunity. So if you haven't had the disease, then you get the vaccine because it gives you protection without the risks of having the disease.
Dr. McCarry?
For example, I'm a big fan of the measles vaccines. I'm not vaccinated against measles because I had measles before it was available. No reason for me to take it.
It's to downgrade the severity of illness among those who are high risk and not already immune.
Dr. Bhattacharya?
What Dr. McCarry said and what Dr. Kuldorff said. We want to, if it can prevent disease, great, but then also to mimic what happens with natural infection without having to have natural infection.
And Dr. Benjamin?
Yeah, it teaches your body to respond to an infectious agent.
Yes, so in essence, we vaccinate people in order to develop immunity. So very early on in the pandemic, certainly by the time the Delta variant came along, we already knew at that point in time that infection-acquired immunity, if we had looked at real-world evidence, which we in the Doctors Caucus and we on members of this committee asked the FDA and CDC to look at, we would have acknowledged that there was infection-acquired immunity, it was valid, but yet our message to the public was that you're mandated to get a vaccine, and I think as you've alluded, this eroded trust in our public health communities. And I can tell you as a former director of public health who has good relationships with all of my county public health directors, and in Iowa there are 101, even though we have 99 counties,
They felt that this was a misstep by the CDC and a misstep by the FDA. So can you expand a little bit on infection-acquired immunity, the validity of it in SARS-CoV-2, and then whether or not we should be acknowledging that in children, placing SARS-CoV-2 or COVID and vaccines on the recommended list for vaccines will, I think, hurt most of our low-income, impoverished children, our Head Start programs, as Dr. Joyce had mentioned.
Yeah, by forcing children to have a vaccine that they don't need because they've already had the disease, that undermines the trust in other vaccines, like the measles vaccines or the polio vaccine, and that's very, very serious. I think during the last several decades, we have the never vaccinate people or the anti-vaccine people have tried to undermine the trust in vaccine, but with very little success. But the vaccine fanatics who wants to vaccinate every person in this country, even though they are children who has very little risk for it, even though they have already had the COVID, that has undermined the trust in other vaccines enormously, creating enormous vaccine hesitancy.
So not allowing their provider or physician to determine the risk and the benefit.
Yeah, and also people themselves, because people know that about immunity. We learn that in school. People know that if you've had a disease, you are...
It wasn't until I came to Congress that I found out infection-acquired immunity was a novel concept.
Yeah, I guess we knew about it since 430 BC of the Athenian plague until 2020, and then we didn't know about it for 3 years, and now we know about it again, so...
We have a little bit more time. Do any of our other witnesses want to comment?
I mean, I want to echo what Dr. Kuhler said and the seriousness of this. The putting the vaccine on the childhood schedule, this vaccine where there's deep distrust, essentially sends a signal to the American public that these are equivalent to the polio vaccine, the measles vaccine, the DPT vaccine, all of which are absolutely essential for the health of children. Putting this on the childhood schedule decreases the uptake of those, then we will look back on this as a seminal mistake in American public health.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. No closing remarks. We both just want to thank you very much for being here today, for your testimony. We have a long way to go on this, as you all know and recognize. And I thank you for your honest opinions today. And we will move forward from here and likely see you again. With that, I adjourn.